Cunningham. She did it again. Sophie Cunningham absolutely embarrassed the Indiana Fever coaches, especially Brianne January, who's supposed to be the defensive guru. I mean, Stephanie White came here from Connecticut. They told me she was a defensive coach when she got here. But Sophie Cunningham blasted them, letting it be known, man, the defense sucks. Whatever they have us doing sucks. This whole thing sucks, man. We got to get into it.
Something happened inside the Indiana Fever organization that nobody in professional basketball was prepared for. Not the fans, not the analysts, not even the insiders who thought they had a firm grip on the situation. A single locker room confrontation, one that reportedly lasted no more than a few volatile minutes, allegedly brought an entire franchise structure crashing down from the top. And the person standing at the center of it all, the player who reportedly struck the match that lit the whole thing on fire, was not who most people would have predicted. Before we get into the specifics, understand how rare this kind of thing actually is. Full organizational purges do not happen in the middle of a season unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. General managers do not get dismissed alongside head coaches unless ownership has decided that the rot goes all the way through. And franchises do not rip apart their own front offices unless the alternative, doing nothing, would cost them something far more valuable than the people they are removing. In Indiana's case, that something was Caitlin Clark. And reports suggest that what was happening behind closed doors had become so damaging, so hostile, and so deeply personal that ownership concluded a partial fix was not going to be enough. This is the full story, every layer of it, from the first signs that something was wrong inside the building to the alleged locker room explosion that tore the team's internal structure apart to the sweeping dismissals that followed, to what all of it means for one of the most marketable athletes in the history of women's basketball. Stay with this from the beginning to the end, because what allegedly went down inside Indiana's organization reads less like a sports controversy and more like a cautionary tale about what happens when a franchise convinces itself it can manage a transformative talent rather than empower one. Most people watching Indiana Fever games from the outside during the 2025 season were frustrated, but they could not quite name what was wrong. The team had talent, they had energy, and more than anything, they had Caitlin Clark, who was doing things on the court that still made people stop and rewind. In late July, she dropped 32 points against the Seattle Storm in a performance that had the entire league paying attention. Less than a week later, against Portland, she put together the fourth triple-double of her career, finishing with 26 points and 10 assists. These were not numbers that suggested a player who needed to be reined in. These were numbers that suggested a player who needed to be unleashed. But according to the reports that eventually surfaced, that was precisely the problem. The structure that head coach Stephanie White had built was not one that gave Clark the freedom her game demanded. Sources allegedly described a system that constrained rather than enabled, a coaching philosophy that prioritized a particular style of play even when that style was visibly limiting the team's most dangerous weapon. And what made it worse, according to those same reports, was that this was not a new issue. Players, support staff, and people connected to the organization had reportedly been watching this tension build for months. The complaints were not spontaneous, they had roots. The disconnect between what Clark was producing on the court and what she was allegedly being allowed to do within the offensive scheme had reportedly become one of the worst-kept secrets in the building. Meetings had been held, conversations had happened, and yet, according to the accounts circulating afterward, nothing fundamentally changed. White's system remained in place, the frustrations remained unaddressed, and inside the locker room, the mood was increasingly described by those connected to the team as something close to combustible. All it needed was one person willing to actually say out loud what everyone else had been saying in private. That person turned out to be Sophie Cunningham. What is important to understand about Cunningham before getting into what she allegedly did is that she is not someone who typically makes waves for the wrong reasons. She is a veteran. She is a competitor. She is the kind of player whose teammates describe as someone you want in your corner when things get difficult. So, when reports began emerging that she had walked into a private team meeting and said things that reportedly left the room stunned, people who knew her were not entirely surprised. She had apparently decided staying quiet was no longer a viable option, and what she allegedly said changed everything.
We got to do that. We don't know what we're doing. Like, what? What? Let's get into this. You got Brianne January. This is Brianne January. You see her coming down right here, trying to calm Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham down on the bench. They're just disregarding her. Like, get out of here. Look, you see Sophie say, get out of my way. Get out of my face. Just get out of my face. And this is supposed to be the defensive guru that...
According to the accounts that began circulating in the aftermath of the chaos, what Cunningham did in that room was not impulsive. It was deliberate. She reportedly came in with specific grievances, specific examples, and a specific target. The target was Stephanie White. Cunningham allegedly laid out a direct, point-by-point case for why the coaching staff was failing Caitlin Clark. She was not vague, she was not diplomatic. She reportedly named names, cited decisions, and made clear that in her view, the people responsible for maximizing Indiana's most important asset were instead actively limiting her. The play designs that White had been implementing were characterized, according to reports, as confusing at best and counterproductive at worst. The substitution patterns that had frustrated fans watching from home were described internally as inflexible and driven by ego rather than strategy. And the broader offensive philosophy, one that allegedly kept Clark operating within a restricted framework instead of allowing her to control the game, was called out as the kind of approach that makes sense for teams trying to contain a superstar on the opposing side, not develop one on your own. Cunningham also reportedly turned her fire toward Brianne January, the assistant coach who had been brought in partly for her defensive expertise and reputation. According to the accounts, Cunningham argued that January had not only failed to improve Indiana's defensive performance, but had also played a role in reinforcing and maintaining the environment that was making the locker room untenable. She allegedly accused January of propping up a system that served the coach's preferences rather than the team's needs, and of allowing the dysfunction to continue when she had the standing and the experience to push back against it. The room, by all accounts, was stunned. Not because players had not felt these things, not because the frustrations Cunningham was airing were new to the people sitting in that room, but because nobody had actually said it like this before. Nobody had stood up in front of the coaching staff and laid it all out with that level of directness, that level of specificity, and that level of apparent fury. What had been a shared but unspoken understanding among the players had suddenly become an open, documented confrontation. And once the words were out there, nothing inside that building was ever going to be the same. The confrontation reportedly grew louder and more emotionally charged as it continued. Sources described it as one of the most intense internal moments anyone connected to the organization had witnessed, the kind of scene that people remember for years afterward, not because of what was resolved, but because of what was revealed. The divide between the players and the coaching staff, which had reportedly been widening for months, was suddenly fully visible to everyone in the room. And the question of what would happen next, how White would respond, what the front office would do, and whether there was any realistic path to repairing the damage was now impossible to avoid. Here is where the story shifts from a complicated internal dispute to something that sounds, based on the reports, considerably darker. When a veteran player confronts a coaching staff in that manner, there are a handful of ways a head coach can respond. The mature response, the one that most experienced leaders would at least consider, involves listening, acknowledging, and making some visible effort to address the concerns, even if full agreement is impossible. A coach with strong enough confidence in her own system might push back firmly but fairly, engaging with the substance of the criticism rather than the act of criticizing. These are difficult responses that require emotional discipline, but they are the ones that tend to preserve a locker room and give an organization a chance to move forward. According to the reports that followed, Stephanie White chose none of those paths. What allegedly happened instead was described as retaliatory in nature. White reportedly reacted with what sources characterized as fury, interpreting the confrontation not as a legitimate expression of player frustration, but as an act of insubordination that needed to be punished. Rather than opening a dialogue or attempting to address the specific concerns Cunningham had raised, White allegedly moved to isolate the players involved. According to accounts that circulated afterward, both Clark and Cunningham found themselves pushed to the margins of the team's trusted inner structure. Their voices, reportedly already limited within White's system, were said to have been further suppressed in the wake of the confrontation. Leaked accounts and alleged recordings painted a picture of an atmosphere inside the Indiana facility that had become, in the words of those describing it, genuinely difficult to function within. Clark, according to these reports, was being treated not as the franchise's most important asset, but as a problem to be managed. Cunningham, who had risked her standing within the organization by speaking up, was reportedly being treated as someone who had crossed a line rather than someone who had raised legitimate concerns. The message allegedly being sent by the coaching staff was unmistakable. Challenge us in that room and we will make sure you feel it. For a franchise already dealing with public frustration about the way Clark was being used, this was a catastrophic miscalculation. The fans watching from outside had been expressing their dissatisfaction for months. Analysts covering the league had been questioning Indiana's offensive decisions, and now, internally, the two players at the center of the dispute were reportedly being pushed further away from the decision-making process rather than brought closer to it. The situation had not just failed to improve, it had reportedly gotten considerably worse. What made this particularly alarming to those watching it unfold, according to reports, was the apparent absence of any serious consideration for what the fallout might look like. White's alleged decision to dig in rather than course correct was described by sources as both surprising and revealing. It suggested, at least to the people describing it, that she was prioritizing the preservation of her own authority over the team's ability to function, compete, and eventually win. And in an organization whose entire commercial and competitive future was increasingly tied to one player, that kind of prioritization was not something ownership could afford to ignore. One of the more striking elements of this story, according to the reports, is the way Caitlin Clark responded to the situation she reportedly found herself in. She could have distanced herself from the conflict. She could have kept her head down, said nothing publicly, and allowed the storm to pass around her while continuing to perform on the court. That would have been the safer play, professionally speaking. It would have given her deniability, preserved her relationship with the coaching staff, however damaged, and allowed her to focus entirely on her own game. Some players in her position would have taken exactly that approach. According to the accounts, Clark did not. Instead, she reportedly stood beside Cunningham. When the alleged retaliation began and the coaching staff moved to push both players to the margins, Clark chose not to separate herself from the situation or from her teammate. She reportedly made her position clear internally. She was not going to pretend that what was happening was acceptable, and she was not going to abandon the person who had gone out on a limb by saying what she said in that meeting. The two players were reportedly aligned, presenting a unified front that the coaching staff had not anticipated and could not easily neutralize. This created a problem that went far beyond a simple personality clash between a head coach and a couple of unhappy players. What was allegedly unfolding inside Indiana's facility was now something that carried real organizational consequences. You had the team's most valuable player, the athlete around whom the franchise's entire future was being built, commercially and competitively, openly refusing to accept a situation that team leadership had created. You had one of her most vocal teammates standing right beside her, and you had a coaching staff that, according to reports, had responded to the confrontation by escalating rather than de-escalating. The locker room, sources said, effectively split into two sides. On one side were players and staff aligned with the coaching structure and protective of White's authority. On the other were Clark, Cunningham, and reportedly others who shared their frustrations but had not yet said so as openly. The middle ground, the space where teams can usually paper over their internal differences and find enough unity to compete, was reportedly shrinking fast. What people inside the building were allegedly dealing with was no longer just a coaching dispute. It was a fracture that touched nearly every part of the organization: the offense, the culture, the relationship between the players and their leadership, and ultimately the question of what Indiana was going to look like going forward. All of it had reportedly become entangled in a conflict that the coaching staff had inflamed rather than resolved. And the longer it went unaddressed at the ownership level, the harder it was going to be to put back together. It was at that point, according to reports, that the front office decided it had seen enough. When news began emerging that Stephanie White had been removed as head coach of the Indiana Fever, the reaction from much of the fan base was immediate and forceful. There was relief, there was vindication, and there was the kind of raw satisfaction that builds up over months of watching something go wrong without any sign that anyone in charge is paying attention. But the removal of White was only part of what reportedly happened. Amber Cox, who had arrived as Indiana's general manager in October of 2024, was also reportedly dismissed as part of what sources described as a sweeping organizational response to everything that had unfolded. Cox's removal was significant for a specific reason. It suggested that ownership's conclusion was not simply that the head coach had mismanaged the situation, but that the broader leadership structure had failed to prevent it, address it, or course correct once it became clear how serious things had gotten. Think about what that means for a moment. A general manager who had been in the role for less than a year, overseeing a franchise that had just experienced one of the most talked about player acquisitions in WNBA history, was removed in the middle of a season. That does not happen as a reaction to a single bad performance or a rough stretch of games. That happens when ownership looks at the totality of what has occurred, the internal reports, the player complaints, the alleged atmosphere inside the facility, the handling of a once-in-a-generation talent, and concludes that something systemic had gone wrong at multiple levels simultaneously. What the reported dismissals communicated, both to people inside the organization and to the broader league, was unambiguous. Indiana's ownership had made a decision about what mattered most, and what mattered most was not protecting the people in charge. It was protecting the player who gave the franchise its best chance at building something meaningful. The message embedded in those firings, whether ownership intended it this way or not, was essentially this: you do not get to mismanage Caitlin Clark and keep your job.
Stephanie White came into Indiana with a real coaching resume. She had guided the Fever to the WNBA Finals in 2015. She was widely regarded as a knowledgeable and experienced basketball mind. None of that was enough to protect her once ownership apparently concluded that she had chosen personal authority over the team's best competitive interests. Her career accomplishments did not change what was allegedly happening inside that locker room, and according to reports, they were not enough to change ownership's mind once a decision had been made. Cox's removal sent a slightly different but equally pointed message. It told everyone watching that Indiana was not going to locate the blame exclusively in the coaching staff and pretend the broader leadership structure had nothing to do with how things developed. Somebody in that front office had been overseeing this situation as it deteriorated. Somebody had reportedly been receiving information about the internal climate and either choosing not to act on it or failing to recognize how serious it was becoming. The sweeping nature of the reported dismissals suggested that ownership had concluded the accountability needed to be sweeping as well. There is something almost impossible to script about the way this story reportedly concluded. According to the circulating accounts, Stephanie White and the coaching structure around her had allegedly worked to push Caitlin Clark and Sophie Cunningham to the margins of the organization's inner circle. The goal, at least as described by sources, was apparently to reassert coaching authority after the confrontation in the meeting room, to make clear who was in charge of the building and who would face consequences for publicly challenging that authority. In other words, the people running Indiana's basketball operation reportedly tried to freeze out two of their most prominent players, and in the end, they were the ones who were frozen out entirely. White lost her job. Cox lost her job. The players they allegedly tried to sideline are still on the roster, still at the center of the franchise's future, and still, in Clark's case, the most talked about name in women's basketball. The attempted reversal of power inside that organization did not just fail, it reportedly accelerated exactly the outcome it was trying to prevent. By choosing retaliation over reform and escalation over accountability, the coaching staff allegedly handed ownership the clearest possible evidence that the situation could not be resolved without removing the people who had created it. For Sophie Cunningham specifically, the reported outcome represents something remarkable. She is not the biggest name on this roster. She is not the player whose face is on the billboards or whose jersey drives merchandise sales. She is a veteran role player who made a decision that most people in her position would have avoided, walked into a room and said the things that other people were only saying to each other in private, and absorbed whatever retaliation came her way without backing down. And according to the reports, that decision, as professionally risky as it reportedly was, may have been one of the most consequential acts in the recent history of this franchise. That is not a minor thing. The WNBA has seen plenty of internal conflicts over the years. Players and coaches have clashed, locker rooms have fractured, front offices have made decisions that frustrated their rosters. But the specific dynamic of a veteran player going directly at a coaching staff on behalf of a transcendent talent, forcing the organization to confront what was really happening, and ultimately contributing to a chain of events that resulted in a complete top-down restructuring, that is something rarer. It is the kind of thing that gets remembered. For the fans, the reported firings carry a weight that goes beyond this particular coaching staff or this particular season. Indiana supporters have been watching, sometimes helplessly, as concerns about Clark's usage and the franchise's direction went apparently unaddressed for months. They have been expressing those concerns loudly on social media, in comment sections, in every space where WNBA conversations happen. The reported dismissals feel, to many of those fans, like the first real signal that someone with the actual power to act was finally listening, and not just listening, responding.
The message that reportedly ripples out from Indiana's purge into the rest of the WNBA is one that every franchise with aspirations would be wise to absorb. If you are fortunate enough to build your roster around a transformative talent, someone who changes the commercial landscape of your league, sells tickets, drives media interest, and produces elite basketball simultaneously, you do not get to handle that player carelessly. You do not get to restrict her, sideline her, or use organizational politics to manage her into a smaller role than her ability demands. The cost of getting that wrong, as Indiana allegedly discovered, can be the entirety of your coaching and front office leadership. The firings answered one set of questions and opened up an entirely different one. Who leads this team now? What does Indiana's coaching search look like in the middle of a season? What kind of head coach does the ownership group have in mind? Someone who will build entirely around Clark's strengths? Someone with a strong defensive background to address the team's persistent issues on that end? Or some combination of both? These are not abstract questions. They have direct implications for the remainder of this season and for what Indiana looks like heading into the offseason. Clark herself has reportedly been dealing with a back injury that has limited her availability and created additional anxiety among the fan base. Back injuries in professional basketball are notoriously unpredictable. They can be managed effectively with the right approach, or they can linger and evolve into something more serious depending on how they are handled. The reports around her status have been cautious and non-committal, which is appropriate given the nature of the injury, but understandably frustrating for everyone invested in her performance and her health. What the coaching change potentially does for Clark's long-term situation is significant. Whoever takes over Indiana's bench, the expectation from ownership reportedly will be that the offensive system is built to maximize what Clark does best: running pick-and-roll actions, operating as a primary decision-maker with the ball in her hands, shooting off movement, and creating advantages for teammates with her vision and passing ability. a coaching staff that constructs its approach around those abilities rather than around a preferred philosophical framework that happens to fit those abilities poorly, gives Indiana a completely different ceiling as a competitive organization. The broader question hanging over all of this is one that goes beyond X's and O's. It is a question about culture. What kind of environment does Indiana build in the wake of everything that allegedly happened? How do they establish trust with the players who witnessed or experienced the dysfunction that was reportedly taking place? How do they ensure that the next coaching staff inherits a locker room that is functional, healthy, and actually capable of channeling the enormous talent on this roster into consistent competitive performance? These are questions that do not get answered overnight. Rebuilding an organizational culture after a significant rupture takes time, thoughtful leadership, and a genuine commitment to doing things differently, rather than just replacing the faces at the top while repeating the same patterns underneath. Indiana's ownership reportedly understood that the moment had arrived for dramatic action. The harder and more important work is what comes after the dramatic action, what they choose to build in the space they have created.
There is also something worth sitting with that extends beyond Indiana specifically. Caitlin Clark's presence in the WNBA has done something genuinely unusual. It has forced conversations about how elite talent is developed, how franchises allocate authority, and how the league presents itself to the enormous new audience that has arrived to watch her play. Those conversations are uncomfortable for some people and overdue for others, but they are happening. And if what allegedly occurred inside the Indiana Fever organization has anything to teach the broader league, it is this: talent at that level is not a problem to be managed, it is an opportunity to be maximized. And the franchises that understand the difference between those two things will be the ones that thrive. Indiana now reportedly has the chance to be one of those franchises. Whether they seize it is still an open question. But for the first time in what has felt like a long time for the people who care most about this team, the reported outcome of this entire combustible situation suggests that somebody in that organization finally asked the right question. Not how do we protect the structure we have built, but what does this player need in order to be everything she is capable of being? Getting the answer right matters. Not just for Indiana, not just for Clark, but for every player in that locker room, every fan who has invested emotionally in this franchise, and every person who has been watching the WNBA grow in real time and hoping that growth continues. What happens next inside that building will say a great deal about whether the lessons of this reportedly chaotic, damaging, and ultimately transformative period were actually absorbed, or whether Indiana has simply cleared the way for the next version of the same mistake. The locker room confrontation that allegedly started all of this lasted a matter of minutes. The decisions that follow could shape this franchise for the next decade.